In every era, there are tales so unsettling that even time refuses to bury them. Stories whispered across generations, warnings carved into the memory of a place. Tonight, we return to 19th century Virginia, a celebration that was meant to unite two families, but instead erased an entire room of witnesses. What happened inside the Thorne estate after the bride and groom's first kiss? And why was no guest ever seen again? The Thorne estate had always been admired from a distance, its sprawling acres and grand architecture standing like a monument to a family that seemed to command both respect and quiet caution from the surrounding community. Built generations before the wedding of Elias Thorne and Clara Whitlock, the manor was crafted from imported stone and timber, carrying with it an air of old-world elegance that didn't quite match the rugged wilderness of rural Virginia. Locals often spoke of its beauty, but rarely with enthusiasm. Instead, they described it with a tone of restrained curiosity, as if the estate itself demanded a level of reverence. From the wide, echoing halls to the creaking attic beams, everything within the manor had a presence, and people who visited claimed they never quite felt alone while walking through its corridors. Even before the events of 1871, the estate had a reputation for holding on to stories that never fully surfaced, secrets that clung to the walls long after the people involved had passed on. Generations of Thornes had lived under its roof, each adding their share to the whispers that circulated among townsfolk. Some remembered tales from their grandparents, stories of strange lights glowing in the windows at odd hours when no one was supposed to be awake, or the sound of footsteps in parts of the house that had been abandoned for decades. Others spoke of the peculiar behavior of certain Thorne ancestors, individuals who isolated themselves for long periods, locking themselves away in rooms with heavy curtains and refusing visitors for weeks at a time. The family always attributed these accounts to stress, illness, or grief, and although the explanations satisfied polite conversation, they never fully erased the unsettling impression left behind. There was always a sense that the Thornes were guarding something they didn't wish to confront. The estate grounds added to the eerie mystique. The thick forests surrounding the property seemed to inch closer each year, as though the trees were gradually reclaiming the land. Older residents insisted the woods were not like any other in the county. Hunters avoided them, complaining of losing their sense of direction, hearing faint voices in the wind, or feeling watched by something hidden beyond the tree line. Even farmhands hired to tend the land refused to work near the back edge of the property after dusk, claiming the shadows there felt too dense, too heavy, as though they were filled with more than darkness. The Thornes never disputed these accounts. They simply advised workers to stay away from the forest after nightfall. By the time Elias was born, the estate had already become the subject of countless rumors. Some speculated that the Thornes practiced unusual rituals passed down through their lineage. Others believed the land itself was cursed, that something had happened long before the manor was even built, an event buried so deeply in time that only its echoes remained. When Elias grew older, he too sensed the peculiar weight carried by the estate. As a child, he often wandered the halls, discovering hidden nooks and locked doors that seemed to guard more than storage rooms. He remembered moments when the house felt strangely alive, reacting to his presence with creaks, drafts, and shifting shadows. Yet his parents rarely discussed the house's peculiarities, brushing away any questions with gentle but firm dismissal. Despite the unspoken tension surrounding the estate, the Thornes maintained their position as a respected family in the region. They were known for their wealth, generosity, and influence in local affairs. They hosted gatherings, contributed to town improvements, and supported community events. But underneath their polished reputation, the Thornes held tightly to their family history, keeping old journals, letters, and artifacts stored in a locked study that only the head of the family was allowed to enter. Elias remembered being told that some knowledge was a burden, one that only a select few were meant to carry. It was a warning that stayed with him, though he never fully understood its meaning until the days leading up to his wedding. As the wedding approached, the atmosphere within the estate grew noticeably heavier. Servants whispered that the house seemed restless, as if anticipating something it could not express. Doors that normally stayed still began to swing open on their own, and some claimed they heard faint murmurs behind the walls when passing through the west wing. The old portraits that lined the halls appeared to shift in expression when seen from the corner of the eye, their painted eyes following anyone who dared walk the corridor alone. Elias sensed the unease as well, though he tried to dismiss it as pre-wedding nerves. Still, he could not shake the feeling that the house was paying attention to him more closely than ever before. The elders of the family, particularly Elias's grandparents, seemed troubled during the preparations. They held hushed conversations behind closed doors, their voices tense and hurried. Elias caught fragments of their discussions, words like tradition, timing, and consequence, drifting into the hall before the door was shut firmly. Whenever he entered the room, the elders would fall silent, watching him with expressions that mixed concern and resignation. There was a moment, just days before the wedding, when his grandmother took him aside, gripping his hands with surprising strength. She looked at him with eyes full of worry, as though she wished to tell him something urgent, something vital. But after a long pause, she simply released his hands and turned away, as if the truth was too heavy to give voice to. All these small moments hinted at a larger truth buried within the Thorne family history, one tied to the estate and to their lineage in ways Elias was not yet prepared to understand. The house seemed to hold its breath as the wedding day drew nearer, and those attuned to its strange rhythms felt a shift, subtle but unmistakable, as if something long dormant was being stirred awake by the very union the Thornes were preparing to celebrate. Clara Whitlock entered the Thorne family's world like a quiet whisper, a presence that seemed delicate on the surface, yet carried an unspoken weight that people felt long before they understood it. She arrived in Virginia only a few years before the wedding, brought by an aunt who seldom spoke and who departed almost as soon as Clara was settled. No one knew where Clara had lived before that, or what had happened to her family. Every attempt to uncover her background dissolved into vague answers, inconsistent details, and a curious reluctance to speak of the past. Clara herself responded to questions with a polite smile and a gentle change of subject, never rude, but never revealing anything useful either. Her silence was not defensive, it was practiced, habitual, as if she had learned from a young age that speaking too much could invite consequences she wasn't willing to face. People found her presence unsettling, though few admitted it openly. There was something unusual about the way she moved through a room, gracefully yet quietly, as though she were trying not to disturb the air around her. Some guests at social gatherings described a strange feeling when standing too close to her, a faint pressure in the atmosphere or a sudden chill that dissipated the moment she stepped away. Others noticed that animals reacted oddly to her presence. Dogs would either bark uncontrollably or retreat with their tails tucked, and horses grew restless when she passed near the stables. Clara seemed aware of these reactions, but never commented on them. If anything, she appeared accustomed to being an object of quiet unease. Despite these peculiarities, Elias Thorne was drawn to her from the moment he first saw her at a local gathering. Clara stood alone near a window, watching the tree line outside as if she were listening to something hidden within the wind. Elias approached her with polite intent, but the moment she turned to face him, he felt as though he had stepped into the calm eye of a storm. Her eyes held a depth he couldn't quite place, a mixture of sorrow, strength, and an unspoken knowledge that made him feel both curious and unsteady. She smiled softly, and something about that smile lodged itself in his memory long after the evening was over. Their courtship developed slowly, a quiet rhythm of shared walks, soft conversations, and the kind of mutual understanding that didn't require many words. Still, Elias sensed that Clara carried a burden she would not share. There were moments when her expression shifted abruptly, moments when she stared into the distance with a look of profound detachment, as if she were remembering something painful or anticipating something unavoidable. Whenever Elias asked if she was all right, she assured him she was simply tired or lost in thought, but he knew it was more than that, even if he couldn't name what it was. The townspeople formed their own theories about her. Some believed she came from a troubled family and preferred to leave the past behind. Others whispered that her family had been involved in strange beliefs or rituals, hinting at practices that were better left unspoken. A few insisted that Clara resembled a woman who had been seen in another county years earlier, a woman who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. None of these claims were ever confirmed, and Clara offered no clues to support or deny them. Her past remained a blank page, and the more people examined it, the more they felt they were staring into a void rather than a story. As the wedding approached, Clara became even more withdrawn. While the Thorne household bustled with preparations and excitement, she moved through the days with a quiet tension that grew increasingly noticeable. She spent long hours walking alone on the estate grounds, wandering near the old trees at the edge of the forest where the shadows seemed to gather more densely. Servants who watched from a distance claimed they saw the air around her shimmer as she walked, or that the wind seemed to change direction to follow her movements, though such observations were dismissed as nerves or imagination. Inside the manor, Clara avoided certain rooms without explanation, particularly the west wing, where the oldest parts of the house stood. When asked about it, she simply shook her head, her expression tightening for a brief moment, as if she sensed something there that others could not. On one occasion, Elias found her standing in front of an old, locked study door, staring at it with an expression of deep concentration. When he approached her, she startled, something she rarely did, and quickly stepped away, as if she had been caught trespassing in a place she had no intention of entering. There were nights when the staff heard Clara speaking softly in her room, her voice low and rhythmic, almost like chanting or reciting. When knocked upon, she always answered with a calm explanation that she was praying or reading aloud, yet the tone of her voice carried an edge that left listeners unsettled long after they walked away. Elias noticed these changes but convinced himself they were signs of stress. The closer the wedding came, the more he reassured her, though he sensed something within her struggle against a force he couldn't understand. 2 days before the ceremony, Clara's aunt returned briefly, appearing at the estate without warning. She insisted on seeing Clara alone, and the two held a tense conversation behind closed doors. Servants passing in the hallway overheard fragments that hinted at fear, sacrifice, and inevitability. When Clara emerged, her face was pale but composed, while her aunt left the estate in haste, refusing to stay another night on the property. It was the last time anyone saw her. On the morning of the wedding, Clara stood before the mirror in her bridal gown, her reflection pale against the soft candlelight. She stared at herself with an expression not of joy, but of acceptance, as though she knew what the day would demand of her. Elias entered the room expecting to see a nervous but happy bride. Instead, he found Clara enveloped in a quiet stillness that made him hesitate at the doorway. She turned to look at him, her eyes carrying the same depth as the first day they met, but now filled with something else, something heavier, something close to resignation. And though Elias did not yet understand what she carried within her, he sensed that whatever secret Clara held had begun long before their meeting and would follow them into the moment they stood before their guests, waiting for the kiss that would change everything. The wedding night at the Thorne estate unfolded with a grandeur that seemed almost determined to distract from the unease that had been building in the air for days. Lanterns flickered along the pathways, casting warm golden light across the manicured grounds, while inside the ballroom, hundreds of candles glowed from ornate chandeliers, filling the room with a soft radiance that reflected off polished wood floors and tall, arched windows. Guests arrived, dressed in their finest attire, their laughter echoing through the halls as they greeted old friends and admired the elaborate decorations. A string quartet played gentle melodies from a raised platform near the corner of the room, their music weaving seamlessly through the conversations and creating an atmosphere that appeared idyllic on the surface. Yet even the musicians exchanged uneasy glances between performances, as though they sensed something beneath the celebration's brightness. The Thornes spared no expense for the ceremony. The ballroom overflowed with white flowers arranged in towering displays, their subtle fragrance drifting through the room like a delicate veil. Servants moved with swift precision, offering drinks, adjusting table settings, ensuring every detail matched the family's reputation for elegance. But beneath the beauty and bustle, a strange current pulsed through the air, a lingering heaviness that settled over the guests without their noticing. Some felt a faint pressure in their chest upon entering the room, others an inexplicable chill along their spine, but each brushed off the sensation, attributing it to nerves or excitement. When Elias and Clara entered the ballroom, all eyes turned toward them. Elias looked handsome yet tense, his posture carrying both pride and an unspoken worry. Clara, draped in a gown that shimmered like morning frost, walked beside him with a composed grace that drew silent admiration from the crowd. But for those who watched her closely, there was something in her gaze that seemed distant, as if part of her mind wandered far beyond the celebratory scene around them. Her expression remained serene, but her eyes held a depth of stillness that gave the impression she was listening to something no one else could hear. The ceremony began with the officiant's voice echoing throughout the room. His words flowed smoothly, each sentence rising and falling like a familiar prayer. The guests responded with practiced smiles, nodding in approval at the touching sentiments spoken aloud. Elias and Clara stood before everyone, their hands intertwined, yet the temperature around them seemed subtly colder than the rest of the room. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing around to see if anyone else felt it, but everyone remained silent, unwilling to disrupt the atmosphere of celebration. As the vows were spoken, a hush settled over the crowd that felt deeper than simple attentiveness. The air grew unnaturally still, almost heavy, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The candles flickered for a moment, their flames bending in the same direction despite the lack of any noticeable breeze. One of the musicians later claimed that during this moment, his bow felt suddenly stiff in his hand, as if something unseen pressed against it. Another swore she heard a faint ringing in her ears, a subtle vibration that grew stronger the closer the ceremony drew to its climax. Elias spoke his vow with emotion in his voice, squeezing Clara's hand gently as he finished. Clara responded in a soft, steady tone that carried through the room with a clarity that surprised many. Her voice was beautiful, but there was something in it that resonated strangely, leaving a lingering echo in the minds of those listening. For a brief moment, it felt as if the walls themselves absorbed her words, as though the house was listening with more attention than any guest present. When the officiant at last gestured for the couple's first kiss, an almost imperceptible shift rippled through the room. The temperature dropped sharply, sending a wave of goosebumps across the guests. The candles dimmed simultaneously, their flames shrinking as though drawn inward. The musician's hands froze mid-motion, uncertain whether to continue or stop. Even the air felt suddenly thick, as if time itself had slowed in anticipation. Elias leaned toward Clara, his expression a mixture of love and apprehension. Clara's eyes softened, but behind the tenderness lay an unreadable shadow, a quiet acceptance that made her appear both present and distant in the same breath. As their lips met, a silence surged through the ballroom. Not the gentle pause of a captivated audience, but a profound, unnatural stillness that swallowed every sound. The faint murmur of the crowd vanished. The music halted. The rustle of dresses, the quiet shifting of feet, even the whisper of breath. Every noise was consumed by an overwhelming quiet that felt deeper than silence itself. Then came the tremor. A subtle shiver ran through the floorboards, so gentle at first that guests weren't sure they felt it. But it grew quickly, pulsing through the wood like a faint heartbeat. The chandelier crystals rattled with a soft, trembling ring. The candles flickered violently, stretching their flames upward until they appeared almost elongated. A gust of cold air swept through the room, though the windows were firmly shut. In the span of seconds, the warmth of the celebration drained away, replaced by a chilling presence that made even the bravest guests instinctively step back. What happened next could not be easily explained. Some described a sudden, blinding whiteness. Others remembered the sensation of falling, though they remained standing. A few felt the room twist, stretching unnaturally as if its dimensions were warping, and there were those who reported hearing faint voices, soft, distant, layered over one another like whispers carried on a wind no one else could feel. But all agreed on one thing. The moment the kiss ended, an overwhelming force surged through the ballroom, sweeping across the guests with a speed faster than thought, faster than breath. And then, in an instant, the room was empty. In the first stunned moments after the disappearance, the ballroom of the Thorne estate felt like a hollow shell of its former self, as though the life that had filled it only seconds earlier had been scooped out all at once, leaving behind an eerie quiet that settled over every surface. Elias and Clara stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration that now looked strangely artificial, without the presence of the people who had animated it. Tables still bore half-filled glasses, and plates arranged neatly with food untouched. The scent of roasted meat, fresh bread and sugared pastries still hung in the air, clashing uneasily with the sudden coldness that had seeped into the room. The chairs were positioned exactly as they had been during the ceremony, not a single one overturned, not a single cloth disturbed, as though hundreds of guests had risen and dissolved into thin air without disturbing so much as a napkin. The silence felt oppressive, almost physical, as if it pressed itself against the walls and floorboards. Elias's breath came quickly, each inhale loud in the stillness, while Clara stood unmoving, her expression unreadable under the soft glow of the dimmed candles. The string quartet's instruments lay abandoned on the platform, bows and sheet music frozen in the positions they had been mid-performance. It was as though time had stuttered, hiccuped, and refused to resume its natural pace, leaving everything suspended in a strange, heavy calm. Elias stepped forward slowly, half expecting his footfalls to echo loudly, yet the sound was swallowed almost instantly, as if the room had grown thicker, denser. The servants, who had been preparing to bring out the next course only moments before, were gone as well. Their trays sat on the side tables, silverware perfectly arranged, napkins folded immaculately beside them. Nothing indicated they had ever moved from their positions. Elias felt an instinctual dread building in his chest as he walked to the nearest table, running his hand along the linen cloth. It was cold to the touch, noticeably colder than it should have been under the warmth of hundreds of candles. He picked up a wine glass, noting the condensation had stopped mid-drip, a bead of moisture clinging motionless to the side as if frozen in time. When he set it down, the clink sounded muted, absorbed by the strange pressure that filled the air. Clara watched him, her hands clasped gently in front of her, her breathing steady. There was a stillness in her posture that made her seem almost part of the room rather than a living presence within it. Elias turned toward her, searching her expression for some sign of fear, confusion, anything that mirrored the panic rising in him. But Clara's eyes held a distant calm, the same unsettling composure she had shown in the days leading up to the wedding. She stepped forward slowly, glancing around the empty room as though she expected to find the guests hiding behind the curtains or inside the shadows cast by the chandeliers. The ballroom, despite being drained of life, appeared untouched by any struggle or disturbance. The elaborate floral arrangements still stood tall, their petals vibrant and fresh. The candles continued to burn steadily, yet, without their earlier warmth, their flames flickering in a way that suggested an unseen current of air flowed through the room. And the chandeliers, once shimmering with the reflections of hundreds of moving bodies, now cast their light onto emptiness, producing elongated shadows that stretched across the floor like silent, unmoving spectators. There was something profoundly disorienting about seeing so much evidence of celebration without the people who had created it. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the chatter, the music, it all seemed to linger faintly as memory rather than sound. Elias strained his ears, almost certain he could hear echoes of voices far away, muffled and fading. But each time he tried to focus on the sound, it slipped away like water through his fingers, leaving only silence. It was impossible to tell whether the echoes were real or simply remnants of shock playing tricks on his mind. When Elias moved toward the entrance doors, he found them closed, though he didn't remember seeing anyone shut them. The handles were cold, unnaturally so, as if they had been dipped in ice. He attempted to pull them open, but they resisted, not locked, but heavy. It felt like something on the other side pressed back, preventing the doors from moving even an inch. He pushed against them with both hands, but the resistance remained, soft yet unyielding, as though the house itself blocked the way. He turned back to Clara, who stood watching him with an understanding expression that unsettled him more than the sealed doors. The windows offered no comfort either. When Elias approached them, he saw that the view outside had shifted subtly. The grounds were still visible, the trees still rustled in the wind, but there was a faint haze over everything, a distortion in the light that made it appear as though the world outside the ballroom existed at a slight distance from reality. The moonlight seemed too bright, too still, casting the lawn in a pale glow that lacked the motion of a natural night. When he tapped the glass, the sound was dull, muffled, and the surface felt strangely warm compared to the cold air inside. Clara moved toward one of the abandoned chairs, gently running her fingers along its wooden frame. She paused there, her eyes narrowing slightly as though she sensed something lingering in the air that Elias couldn't perceive. A faint shiver ran through her, subtle but unmistakable, and for the first time since the disappearance, her expression shifted, not to fear, but to recognition, as though the emptiness around them confirmed something she had long suspected, something she had hoped would not come to pass. Elias noticed the change, his pulse quickening as he approached her. The room remained utterly still, yet it felt far from empty. There was a presence that lingered in the space where the guests had stood, an invisible pressure that suggested their departure had not been accidental. The absence of footprints, the untouched tableware, the intact decorations, all of it pointed to a removal too swift, too absolute, too seamless to be explained by any natural force. And the deeper Elias looked into the frozen perfection of the room, the more it seemed as though the disappearance was not an event that had interrupted the wedding, but rather a grim conclusion that the house had been waiting for. In the years that followed the disappearance of every wedding guest at the Thorne estate, countless theories took shape, each attempting to grasp a truth that seemed just beyond human understanding. Some of these theories were whispered by townspeople who could no longer bear the weight of silence, others documented privately by historians who stumbled upon fragments of the event through old journals and suppressed family records. Each theory carried its own unsettling logic, shaped by the peculiarities of the estate, the strange energy surrounding Clara Whitlock, and the eerie calm displayed by the bride and groom in the aftermath. While none of these explanations were ever proven, they endured because they filled a void left by the impossible. And the more people studied the event, the more they realized that the truth was unlikely to rest on a single explanation, but rather on a web of forces that had been weaving themselves into the Thorne family's history for generations. One of the earliest theories suggested that the disappearance was a form of ancestral reckoning. According to this belief, the Thorne family had, at some point in their lineage, entered into a binding agreement with an unknown force. Whether it was a pact for prosperity, protection of their land, or survival during a time of hardship, no one could say for certain. But the theory held that such agreements demanded repayment in unpredictable ways, and the wedding represented a convergence of old promises and new conditions. With Clara's arrival, an outsider whose past was veiled in secrecy, the balance of the agreement may have shifted, triggering a response that required the sudden removal of those present. Supporters of this theory pointed to the strange behaviors of the Thorne elders before the wedding, their hushed conversations, their warnings, and their anxious, resigned expressions. They claimed the family knew something was coming but could not find a way to prevent it, only to brace for its arrival. Another theory centered around Clara herself, her unknown origins, her uncanny calm, the way animals reacted to her, and the moments when she seemed to sense things before they happened, led some to believe she carried a kind of inherited curse, not a curse inflicted by malice, but one passed down through bloodline or circumstance, something bound to her existence long before she stepped foot in Virginia. This theory suggested that Clara's union with Elias activated the final stage of that curse, causing it to manifest in a manner as sweeping as it was catastrophic. Proponents insisted that the disappearance was not an intentional act, but an unavoidable consequence of Clara's lineage, one she may have been partially aware of but powerless to stop. The brief visit from her aunt, the warnings exchanged in private, and the aunt's rushed departure only strengthened this argument. It implied the curse was known to Clara's family and that the wedding's outcome had been feared long before it took place. A third theory examined the house itself. The Thorne estate had always been surrounded by rumors of strange occurrences, from shifting shadows to inexplicable sensations felt by visitors. Some believed the house was built on land tied to ancient rituals or sacred ground, a place where the veil between the seen and unseen thinned dangerously. According to this idea, the estate was a kind of conduit, capable of absorbing or releasing energies that could not be controlled. The wedding, with its heightened emotion, its gathering of so many people, and the symbolic act of the couple's first kiss, may have created a surge of energy that the house absorbed and then expelled in a violent, though silent burst. Those who favored this explanation believed that the guests were not destroyed, but transported elsewhere, either temporarily or permanently, caught in a rift between worlds or claimed by whatever force governed the estate's hidden depths. A fourth, more unsettling theory suggested that the event was part of a predetermined cycle. Some old records hinted at past disappearances in the region, smaller in scale, less documented, but bearing similar signs of sudden, inexplicable vanishing. If these stories were connected, it would imply that the Thorne wedding was not an isolated tragedy, but the latest occurrence in a recurring pattern. This pattern may have been tied to lunar cycles, ancestral timelines, or the convergence of certain individuals at the estate. Advocates of this theory believed the wedding was inevitable once the necessary conditions aligned, and that the disappearance represented a ritualistic reset, one that had happened before and would happen again. They pointed to Elias and Clara's calm after the event as evidence that something within them recognized the cycle, even if only subconsciously. A fifth theory, one of the most whispered but least written, offered a more psychological explanation, though no less disturbing. It proposed that the guests had fallen victim to a kind of mass possession or collective trance triggered by a force neither natural nor fully supernatural. The moment of the kiss may have acted as a catalyst, unlocking something dormant within the guests or within the energy of the room. According to this theory, the disappearance was not physical but perceptual, meaning the guests still existed but had been removed from the awareness of the living. They stood among the living world in a suspended state, unseen and unheard, trapped between consciousness and oblivion. Supporters of this theory argued that the faint presence felt in the ballroom afterward, the sense that the room was not truly empty, aligned with this explanation. It suggested that the guests lingered, unable to return yet unwillingly bound to the moment of their vanishing. Despite the differences between these theories, they all shared one unsettling common thread. None of them placed the blame solely on chance. Each explanation implied that the disappearance was rooted in something deliberate, ancient, or inevitable. And as the years passed, the more investigators, historians, and curious wanderers tried to unravel the truth, the more the mystery seemed to thicken, as though it was designed not to be solved, but to be preserved. The Thorne wedding became a story that lived between reality and myth, suspended in a place where answers dissolved just as quickly as they formed, leaving behind only the lingering sense that something vast and unseen had reached into the ballroom that night and rewritten the fate of everyone present.